-2 times 15. -2 times 15. Oh, what is that? So let's see. -2, I gotta take -2 times a 5, but it's a -2 and it's +5. So is that 10? Okay, so then, man, this is really difficult. You know what? I got an accommodation for a calculator. I'm just going to use a calculator. Today's lesson, calculators. So this is one of the questions that I get asked probably the most. And it's not just by parents or even students, but sometimes teachers too. When is it appropriate for SPED students to use calculators? I mean, it doesn't necessarily seem fair that a student can use a calculator in the general ed class when all other students can't, right? But again, they're SPED students. So does that give them free rein? Well, let's look at some schools and what they have to say. So Oregon State says a documented learning disability that impacts mathematical computation using a simple calculator could be a reasonable accommodation. And Kent State says a calculator accommodation provides the equal opportunity to demonstrate mathematical or quantitative reasoning skills for students with a disability that impacts math calculation, such as dyscalculia. Now, that is a disability. It's very similar to dyslexia, but it deals with numbers and getting numbers and signs mixed up and turned around. But what are some other criteria for students with IEPs and 504s? What does the actual wording say? Well, here in Indiana, if a student is taking an iLearn in grades 3 through 5, whether they have an IEP, 504 or not, they're not allowed a calculator, which is understandable because they want to get a real world idea of how the student is doing. But once they get to grade 6, they may be allowed to use a four-function calculator or a handheld adaptive calculator if the IEP and the accommodations say that it's reasonable. They may also be able to use the online Desmos four-function calculator and or a handheld adaptive calculator for all items if the case conference committee determines the accommodation is appropriate based on the student's needs. In grades 7 through 8, students may use a scientific handheld adaptive calculator if listed as an accommodation for calculator segments and performance tasks only. And then students may also use online Desmos scientific calculator and or a handheld adaptive calculator for all items if the case conference committee determines the accommodation is appropriate based on the needs as defined by IDOE's accessibility and accommodations information for statewide assessment documents. So there's a lot of information in there, but it sounds like as long as it's in the IEP, the student does get a calculator. So what is the exact wording in an IEP? Well, it can differ from state to state, but here in Indiana, you might see something like this in an IEP. A student has use of a calculator in classwork, homework, and assessments. That means that if they have difficulty and have dyslexia with math and can't remember the mathematical functions, sometimes a multiplication chart just won't be able to help them, or even a factor chart. So a calculator needs to be used. Student is provided an adaptive handheld calculator for all items on science. You might see this written for biology, the iLearn test that students have to take in high school. They may not be able to use a calculator in social studies because they probably don't need it. But in science, whenever there are math problems in there, they're allowed to use a calculator. And then for the SAT and PSAT, a four-function calculator is allowed, but they're not allowed to use a scientific calculator. So there are limitations. So the simple answer is this. There is no simple answer. And that's okay because that's how SPED is. Each special ed student is unique and their level of accommodations are unique to them because that's why we call it an individualized education plan. But if you have questions about your child's special ed needs and their accommodations and whether or not a calculator needs to be used for all assignments, feel free to talk to your SPED teacher about that because, again, your child may be different than other children and they may have specific needs. But keep in mind that some disabilities, such as dyscalculia, which is which is basically the mathematical version of dyslexia, those the student is going to need a calculator. But if the student can be successful using a multiplication chart or using guided notes or step-by-step instructions on how to solve a one and two-step equation without having to use a calculator, then have them do that. Because again, being reliant on a calculator can be detrimental. But if the need is there, you can't deny it. Now, if you liked what you saw, you learned something new, or you're new to the channel, please click that like button. And if you want updates on future videos, feel free to click the subscribe button and ring the bell for updates on future videos. And as always, if you have questions or comments, or there's a particular topic in special education that you would like me to cover, by all means, drop a line in the comments section and I'd be happy to answer it. Until next time, class dismissed.